Okay, excellent. So most people who follow us will know you, but can you just say your name, who you are, and what you do?
Sure. I'm Paul Offit. I'm the director of the Vaccine Education Center and a member of the Division of Infectious Diseases at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia.
One thing I want to ask about is measles. So measles is a disease that we've seen in the United States not too long ago. There was a major outbreak in 2019. There was an outbreak in 2014. It's something that can kind of pop up if immunization rates dip too low. What is the current threat level posed by measles in the US, and how close are we to a potential measles outbreak?
So, measles is the most contagious of the vaccine preventable diseases. So whenever there's a fraying of immunization rates, measles is often the first disease to come back. Before there was a measles vaccine in 1963, there were roughly 3 to 4 million people, mostly children, who would get measles. There would be about 48,000 hospitalizations, mostly from pneumonia and dehydration, and about 500 deaths. There were also about 1,000 children every year that got measles encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain, of whom about 250 would be left with permanent brain damage. So measles was a serious and occasionally fatal disease. After the vaccine was introduced, we had a dramatic decrease in measles, but there were still occasionally tens of thousands of cases until we offered a two-dose vaccine in 1991. And with that, we basically eliminated measles from the United States by the year 2000. Unfortunately, because of a fraying of immunization rates, because some or a critical percentage of parents are choosing not to vaccinate their children, you're starting to see measles come back. So last year we had, I think, 3 measles outbreaks that accounted for 59 cases. This year meaning 2024, we had roughly 16 outbreaks accounting for about 285 cases. So it's on the rise. That, in combination with the fact that the CDC recently reported in their journal Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report that there is an increase in the number of parents who are choosing to not vaccinate their children, meaning choosing non-medical exemptions. With that, I think that things may get worse. And if you get to 1,000 cases or 2,000 cases for a disease that has a mortality rate of roughly 1 per 1,000, you could once again start to see children die of measles in this country.
And I want to talk about two specific risks of measles, things that people may or may not have heard about. One is SSPE. So we just published a story this morning from a mother who tragically lost her daughter to SSPE, rare complication of measles. Can you just say what that is and talk a little about it?
Right. So SSPE stands for subacute sclerosing panencephalitis. It is a chronic measles infection of the brain. And usually you start to see symptoms years after somebody has recovered from a natural measles virus infection. And there's a deterioration in personality, a deterioration in handwriting, a deterioration then in motor skills, sensory skills, and in basically an inevitable decline that leads to death. There's not much you can do about it. You basically just stand back and watch the child deteriorate and die. I've seen 3 such cases, and it's just enormously frustrating. I think when people think of measles as just something that is a natural phenomenon of childhood, all they have to do is see one case of subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, and they'll do everything they can to get their child a measles vaccine.
Right. Incredibly heartbreaking complication. The woman that we interviewed and wrote the story was actually in Philadelphia. I think she went to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia for treatment for her daughter. But yeah, it's like a 6-month course of a disease where it's going to be fatal, and it's just so sad that.
There are things we do, but there really is no treatment for this chronic measles infection of the brain.
Right. Another thing that people talk about with measles, and I think the understanding of this is maybe a little less strong, but I'm just curious about your thoughts. This thing called immune amnesia, where you get measles and you supposedly have lesser kind of immunity to other diseases afterwards. This is a thing that's a validated threat. Is this real? What about that?
Right. So measles virus can itself be immune suppressive. So that therefore it can decrease your memory response to other either viruses or bacteria to which you've been exposed or vaccinated. So yeah, measles can be immunosuppressive. True.
So since COVID, we've always had an anti-vaccine movement, but it's kind of roared up quite a bit. I think there's been declines in immunization rates around the country. What harms of the anti-vaccine movement have we seen since the pandemic?
I think in some ways with this COVID pandemic, we leaned into a libertarian left hook. And here's what I mean by that. During 2020, when SARS-CoV-2 virus, the cause of COVID, came into this country, we didn't really have anything. So what did we do? We shut down schools, we shuttered businesses, we restricted travel, we isolated, quarantined, masked. Then we had a vaccine by December of 2020. And so for 2021, we wanted to mandate vaccines. But again, I think people saw that as massive government overreach. And now you're seeing the pushback from that spilled over not only to don't mandate COVID vaccines or don't mandate masking, to don't mandate other vaccines. And people are pushing back all sort of under the name of medical freedom, the medical freedom movement, that I want to be free to do what I want to do, independent of how it affects other people. But remember, if you're choosing not to vaccinate yourself or your child for a highly contagious disease like measles, or in this case, SARS-CoV-2, you're not just making a choice for yourself. You're making a choice for those with whom you come in contact. And do you have any responsibility to them? Does medical freedom mean that you have no responsibility to the rest of society? I don't think so. And I just sort of don't like that phrase because I think it's enormously selfish and in many ways dismissive of people who count on those around them to protect them, like the 9 million people in this country who can't be vaccinated because they're getting cancer chemotherapy or immune suppressive therapy for their rheumatologic diseases.
When it comes to people who are immunocompromised, not everyone has a super great conception of who this is or who that might be in their community. What harms have you seen in your work with patients who are immunocompromised getting different diseases?
Sure. So working at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, we see a disproportionate number of children whose ability to fight infections is less than people who are otherwise normal. And so whether it's because they're getting cancer chemotherapy or the whole realm of biological agents that we have now that we didn't have 10 or 15 years ago that suppress various aspects of the immune response. So this is what we see. And it's hard to watch. I think probably the best example of this is when there was a measles outbreak in 2014 that started in Southern California, then spread to 25 other states. There was a state senator named Richard Pan who wanted to basically eliminate the philosophical exemption for vaccination in his state, in the state of California. There wasn't at the time, and it remains not today, a religious exemption. So to eliminate the philosophical exemption would mean to eliminate all non-medical exemptions. So he took it upon himself to do that. It was hard. I think when they would have meetings where parents would be able to come in and discuss this, there often were the anti-vaccine folks who were there in force. There was one little boy who sort of got this legislation to eliminate the philosophical exemption over the line. And it was a little boy named Rhett Crowett, who was about 7 years old. He had acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And he would stand up at those meetings and they would put him on a stool so he could reach the microphone. And he would say, I have leukemia. I depend on you to protect me. What about me? Don't I count? And to me, he was the voice of society.
So in terms of like the anti-vaccine movement post-COVID, we kind of talked about COVID and that kind of spill over into other diseases. Do you think there's any like quantifiable harms that we already see from this kind of backlash?
Sure. Well, in addition to the increase in the number of measles cases from 2023 to 2024, you've seen a dramatic increase in pertussis or whooping cough cases from 5,000 cases in 2023 to 32,000 cases in 2024. I mean, you had a man, a 27-year-old man in Rockland County, New York, who had never left this country, who lived in a community that had immunization rates of around 30%, who got paralytic polio, because there are strains of polio circulating in this country that are derived from the original oral polio vaccine, Albert Sabin's live weakened attenuated polio vaccine. And the problem with that vaccine, and the reason we haven't used it for 25 years in this country, is that virus could essentially revert to neurovirulent type or wild type. That vaccine strain could do that. And those are the strains that are around. That's the strain that's causing the outbreak currently in Gaza. And to think that, well, we don't have to worry about polio anymore. They showed in the wastewater samples in Rockland County as well as in surrounding counties that this strain was there. And when you're paralyzed by polio, you're the tip of an iceberg because only about 1 of every 200 people infected with polio is paralyzed by it. So what I wish the CDC would do, frankly, is look not only in wastewater samples near where this man lived, but look in wastewater samples in Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles, to see whether those strains are around. And I would bet that they are. So this is a disease still to fear. And I think people make a mistake when they choose not to vaccinate their children.
So with pertussis and the vaccine that we have now, my understanding is we can't prevent every case of it. The goal really is to protect kids who are a lot younger, newborns from this disease. The vaccine used to be different too, from my understanding. So was it more effective before? And if so, why did we switch vaccines?
Right. So the original pertussis or whooping cough vaccine was introduced in 1947. It was made by taking the bacteria, this Bordetella pertussis, growing it up in specialized media, and then basically inactivating it with a chemical like formaldehyde. So basically, you're inactivating the whole bacteria plus the toxins that the bacteria make. So if you look at the number of immunological components that was in that vaccine, it was about 3,000 immunological components. It's the only time we've ever given a whole killed bacterial vaccine in this country. And it did a remarkable job at decreasing the number of hospitalizations and deaths from pertussis, basically from 8,000 deaths a year to far fewer than that. The problem with that vaccine is it had a difficult safety profile. It could cause fever, including high fever. It could cause seizures associated with fever. It could cause something called hypotonic hyporesponsive syndrome, sort of like a severe form of fainting, if you will. And that was a difficult vaccine. It didn't cause any permanent harm, but it did cause sort of immediate harms. And so there was an interest then in moving away from that vaccine to the so-called acellular vaccine. So instead of using a whole bacterial cell, you just use, depending on the product, 2 to 5 individual components of that bacteria, specifically toxins that you would then inactivate so that they would become toxoid. So they couldn't do harm, but they could induce an immune response. And with that, you had a much better safety profile. But the whole cell bacterial vaccine really was better in terms of protecting against disease. So you are seeing more failures associated with this acellular vaccine than we saw previously with the whole cell pertussis vaccine. Nonetheless, we still have a dramatic decrease in the number of cases. And looking at that more recent increase in cases, it really seems to be due not to the failure of the vaccine as much as to the failure of people to get the vaccine.
So another question I wanted to ask, and you probably have lots to say about this, but I'll just kind of leave it open-ended. What vaccine preventable diseases have you seen in real life?
Well, I'm a child of the 50s. I mean, I had measles, I had mumps, I had rubella or German measles, I had chickenpox. I had all those diseases. I've certainly seen pertussis in real life. I've seen varicella in real life, meaning in our hospital. I've seen Haemophilus influenza B, which is a cause of sepsis and meningitis and pneumonia. I've seen pneumococcus in real life. I've seen meningococcus in real life. I've seen the effects of human papillomavirus, which is cancer in real life. So I've seen all those diseases. And, I, at the age of 5, had a basically failed operation on my right foot, which landed me in Cernans Hospital for Crippled Children back in the days in the 1950s when you could use words like crippled and feeble-minded in the names of Children's Hospital. And when you're in a chronic care facility, orthopedic facility in the 1950s, you're in a polio ward. So I was in a polio ward, and I saw children in iron lungs. I saw children in traction who were being treated with something called the Sister Kenny hot pack treatments. This was a nurse in Australia who believed that if you took these excruciatingly hot packs and put them on withered arms, put them on withered legs, that could help restore function. But it was torture. These children would scream. This was 1950s. There was 1 visiting hour a week on Sundays from 2 to 3. My mother was ill with a complication of the pregnancy with my brother. My father was a traveling salesman, so he didn't come. So I was never visited. For the 6 weeks that I was in that hospital, listening to children scream, looking at children in iron lungs, it was like a scene out of a Charles Dickens novel. Honestly, it was like hell on earth, and it remains my current concept of hell.
So I want to go into some specific concerns about vaccines, questions people have, things I've seen online. Of course, I am pro-vaccine, so these are not necessarily my beliefs, but I do want to go over some questions that I've heard people kind of pose. One thing that keeps coming up is about the hepatitis B birth dose for the vaccine. So people think of this disease as something that typically is spread through like injection drug use or sex or things that they think babies are not typically doing. So why do we give a dose of the vaccine on the first day of life? And is it really that important to do it then versus say like 2 months later or something?
Okay, so before there was a newborn hepatitis B vaccine recommendation in 1991, every year in this country, there'd be about 18,000 children less than 10 years of age who would be infected with hepatitis B. About half of those children got that virus by passing through a birth canal from a mother that was infected with hepatitis B. The other half didn't. They got it from relatively casual contact with people who had hepatitis B who didn't know it. That's why it's called the silent epidemic. Some people are chronic carriers of this virus and don't know it, millions of people. And they would get a kiss, the 6-year-old would get a kiss from Uncle Bob and not realize that he had, hepatitis B. So then we introduced the birth dose in 1991. And with that, we eliminated hepatitis B in children less than 18 years of age. The 18,000 cases basically are gone. The problem with hepatitis B is if you don't get vaccinated early, let's say you do pass through a birth canal where the mother has hepatitis B and you acquire the virus, you're much more likely to go on to develop chronic liver disease, cirrhosis, and liver failure and liver cancer. Now, people will say, yeah, but I screened for that. That's why we screened for hepatitis B. Well, first of all, no screening test is perfect. Secondly, you may acquire hepatitis B after you've gotten the screening test. And third, you want to jump with a net, because if you do acquire hepatitis B in those first few weeks of life, you are far more likely to go on to develop liver cancer or liver cirrhosis. That's why it's important to give the birth dose.
Gotcha. And is there any difference in the safety of, again, giving it like 2 months later versus giving it at birth?
Remember, when you're in the birth in utero, when you're still in the womb, you're in a relatively sterile environment. But when you enter the birth canal in the world, you're not. And very quickly, you have living on the surface of your body trillions of bacteria to which you make an immune response. The hepatitis B vaccine is one protein. It's the hepatitis B surface antigen, whether it's the Recombivavax vaccine or the Engerix vaccine. It's one protein, hepatitis B surface antigen. When you're colonized with bacteria, each bacteria has between, 2,000 to 3,000 proteins, which are all immunological components, which will stimulate your immune response. I mean, the hepatitis B vaccine is not just sort of figuratively a drop in the ocean of which you typically encounter and manage every day. It's literally a drop in the ocean of which you typically encounter and manage every day. If you're overwhelmed by the one protein in the hepatitis B vaccine, you're in trouble.
So another thing that has similar concerns with it is the HPV vaccine. People say, okay, well, usually HPV is transmitted sexually, and yet we seem to give the vaccine quite early, around age 11 or 12, and sometimes there's pushes to do it even earlier. Why do we give the HPV vaccine when we do?
So you want to give the HPV vaccine before people have sex, because that's typically how human papillomavirus or HPV is acquired. Once you're infected with HPV, that virus, then most people eliminate the virus, and that's the end of it. But not everybody. And every year there'd be tens of thousands of people, women, who would go on to develop cervical cancer, or men who would go on to develop head and neck or anal and genital cancers. And it can take 15, 20, 25 years. So you acquire the disease young, and about 80% of people who go through college between 18 and 22 years of age will get infected with human papillomavirus. So it's a common infection, and it's a common cause of cancer. So that's why you want to vaccinate people before they have sex. Now, there have been some people who would argue, well, the vaccine causes infertility. This has been one thing that's been brought up, but that's been studied. They've looked prospectively at people who either did or didn't get that vaccine to answer the question, does it affect fertility? The answer is no. The second question is, well, does it affect promiscuity? Meaning, are you more likely to be sexually promiscuous if you've gotten the vaccine than if you hadn't? First of all, the human papillomavirus vaccine prevents a number of critical serotypes or types of human papillomavirus vaccine, not all. So even the HPV vaccine doesn't protect against all serotypes of HPV, nor does it protect against chlamydia or syphilis or gonorrhea. So sort of saying, well, I've gotten the HPV vaccine, now I can have unprotected sex and not worry about it because, I'm good, is the equivalent of saying, okay, now I've had a tetanus vaccine, I can, run across a bed of rusty nails and not worry about it. So people have done studies looking at whether it changes sexual activity, whether you've gotten the vaccine or if you haven't, and not surprisingly, there's no difference.
Another thing that I kind of hear from, the crowd, Children's Health Defense, ICANN, all these different organizations, one thing they kind of play on is the rising chronic diseases in the United States, or the perceived rise in chronic diseases in the United States. And these claims that kids used to be healthier, obviously not in like the 1920s or whatever, but maybe like 1970s, 1980s, these claims come up. Did children, and again, not my belief necessarily, but did children used to be healthier in the 1970s, either in terms of like lifespan or chronic disease? Because I think that's what I hear a lot from these people.
Chronic diseases, including cancers, correlates with one thing: age. The older you are, the more likely you are to develop a chronic disease or the more likely you are to develop cancer. We live longer than we used to. We live 30 years longer than we did 100 years ago. And that's in many ways because of vaccines and a variety of other things, less smoking, et cetera. So is there an increase in chronic diseases? Yes. And that's because we live longer. It has nothing to do with vaccines, other than the fact that you would argue vaccines have allowed us to live longer.
Gotcha. And so when it comes to other, say, chronic conditions that might affect kids, so, they often bring up ADHD or autism, or, things like diabetes or things like that. Has there been an increase in chronic disease in kids?
Well, I think to take autism or autism spectrum disorder, I think that is a more recognized disorder than it was, say, 30 or 50 years ago. And so people are more likely to make that diagnosis. There are some things that are associated with autism, primarily paternal age. Sort of in the same way that maternal age is associated with an increased incidence of Down syndrome, paternal age is associated with an increased incidence of autism, but it's genetic. I mean, there's probably a large percentage of autism, certainly primary autism is genetic, and then also a significant percentage of autism spectrum disorder is genetic. So I'm not sure there's anything we do post-birth that affects that incidence. It's really something that's determined prior to birth.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to ask on that kind of thread. Maybe I'll say one other thing that I often hear from that crowd that seems to motivate that crowd is that the United States in general seems to have a lot of health problems. As a country, we don't live that healthily. A lot of people are kind of, living with, and some of these things are obvious in their causes, right? So obesity, diabetes, et cetera. But it seems like we're not the healthiest country, and our government is not doing amazingly at managing a lot of the kind of chronic conditions that we have. Why then would we trust them to regulate other things, whether it be medicines, vaccines, or anything like that?
Well, I mean, well, it's true that we have, for example, a $1.85 trillion Health and Human Services budget, and we have 80,000 people that work in the Department of Health and Human Services. We probably spend more per capita than most other developed world countries. Nonetheless, we're way down on the list in terms of infant mortality, in terms of longevity. True, and that has a lot to do with health choices that we make in terms of what we eat, what we drink, whether we exercise, whether we smoke, et cetera. So, yeah, I think we need to make lifestyle changes that will help us live longer. And we need to have a healthcare system that works much better for us than the current healthcare system is working for us. But it's not because doctors don't know what they're doing, or it's not because scientists don't know what they're doing. It's because I think our healthcare system is in many ways broken. That's true.
So one thing I want to ask about as well, I've had encounters, I guess, with the anti-vaccine movement. And again, I've been at this less long than you have, but sometimes I just see behavior that's not amazing. So give an example. ACIP does those public comment sessions where anybody can sign up, and they vote on vaccine recommendations, and people kind of give a public comment of their opinion on it. I was talking about flu vaccines, and I gave a story about somebody who had died from flu, a father who had lost their child to flu, and I said, it's true that it might be low risk, but low risk is not no risk. Children's Health Defense, the organization, said Voices for Vaccines endorsed the vaccine despite the fact that they admitted it's low risk. They cut out the second sentence where I was talking about a child dying from flu and just said low risk for flu. So some of these organizations really just don't do great things. And without being too mean, can you speak to your experiences with the anti-vaccine movement? Anything that's kind of particularly struck you throughout your long kind of pushback against them?
No, if you look at the organizations you mentioned, like the Informed Consent Action Network or Children's Health Defense, quite simply, they lie. They misrepresent data again and again and again for the purpose of scaring people away from vaccines. They don't like it that vaccines are mandated, and they feel that you shouldn't mandate something that is dangerous. And so they consistently misrepresent the harms from vaccines. I mean, any sort of vaccines, certainly can cause problems, can cause adverse events, but usually none of the ones they talk about. So they're basically just a disinformation campaign. And these days, they're much better funded than they ever have been before, I think in large part because of this pandemic.
One last question, I guess, before I let you go. I've heard you talk about lab leak before. What would be kind of the simplest, strongest argument against COVID being a lab leak virus?
So SARS-CoV-2 started in the Hunan wholesale seafood market at one particular section in the southwestern section. How do we know that? We know that because there's genetic evidence that the virus was there. We know that because the first few cases were right there in that one stall of the Hunan wholesale seafood market. We know that because all the original cases then spread out from that market. We know that it didn't start in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which was 9 miles away on the other side of the Yangtze River, where none of those cases were detected. They were all around this one section of the Hunan wholesale seafood market. We know by phylogenetic analysis, when you look at the people who got infected, that you could then trace it back to those animals that were there, or at least the genetic evidence of the animals that were there, whether it was palm civets or bamboo rats or raccoon dogs, it was all there. This is exactly the same way that SARS-1 started, also in China, also associated with the wet market. In fact, recently, Shi Zhangli, who is the head of the Wuhan Institute of Virology's section working on bat coronaviruses, sequenced the 56 remaining viruses that were there to show that we're in no way a precursor to this virus. All the evidence is on one side. This is a scientific question that should be answered in a scientific venue, and it has been. If you look at all the publications, whether it's in Cell or Nature or Science, they all show that this was a animal to human spillover event, just like SARS-1. There were two separate lineages that rose from that one market. So you would have to argue that two separate scientists were infected and then happened to go to the one place where you would expect an animal to human spillover event, as compared to the other 10,000 places in Wuhan where you could have gone if you were interested in sort of seeing this virus spread. There has never in the history of humankind been a pandemic virus created in a laboratory. So if you're going to make that case, you have to do a little better than just appealing to conspiracy and innuendo.